The Grail, Quest for the Eternal, by John Matthews. The symbol of the Grail has occupied a place in the imagination since awareness of it first dawned in the European Middle Ages, and it continues to exert a fascination upon all who come within its sphere of influence. Yet there is no single, clearly defined image of the Grail, nor indeed evidence that it ever existed. Opinions differ widely about the origins of the stories that have circulated in written form since the beginning of the 12th century. Its outward shape is debated. It may be a cup, a shallow dish, a stone, or a jewel, yet most agree that it is a profound and mysterious thing, perhaps worth giving up the whole of one's life to find, even in the knowledge that the search may be fruitless. It was this quest that dominated the stories of the Grail throughout the Middle Ages, and no matter what form the quest took, the objective remained the same, a spiritual goal representing inner wholeness, union with the divine, self-fulfillment. The scene is usually set in a far-off country of paradisal status, where the Grail is housed in a temple on top of a mountain, surrounded by water and protected by obstacles which only the chosen few can overcome. Its guardian is both a priest and a king, at once alive and dead, and the rewards of the hero successful in the quest are good fortune, blessings, and sometimes the hand of the king's daughter. These elements are the basic matter of the story and are to be found in varying forms in a worldwide mythological context, by no means always Christian. For though the Grail became firmly entrenched in the Western imagination as a symbol of Christ's teaching, it can be shown that a considerable amount of the imagery originated in Eastern cultures. But before we can begin to separate the many strands that constitute the life of the symbol, it is necessary to remind ourselves of the story as it has come down to us by way of the medieval texts. They tell us almost all we know of the Grail's outward history, and it is from them that the following narrative is reconstructed. The story begins with Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy Jew to whose care Christ's body is given for burial, and who, according to some stories, also obtains the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. While he is washing the body to prepare it for the tomb, some blood flows from the wounds which he catches in this vessel. After the disappearance of the body, Joseph is accused of stealing it, is thrown into prison, and deprived of food. Here Christ appears to him in a blaze of light, and entrusts the cup to his care. He then instructs Joseph in the mystery of the Mass, and, it is said, certain other secrets, before vanishing. Joseph is miraculously kept alive by a dove, which enters his cell every day and deposits a wafer in the cup. He is released in AD 70 and joined by his sister and her husband, Braun, goes into exile overseas with a small group of followers. A table called the First Table of the Grail is constructed to represent the table of the Last Supper. A fish is laid in Christ's place, at which 12 may sit down. A 13th seat, representing the place of Judas, remains empty after one of the company tries to sit in it and is swallowed up. This seat is thereafter referred to as the Siege Perilous. According to some versions, Joseph then sails to Britain, where he sets up the first Christian church at Glastonbury, dedicating it to the Mother of Christ. Here the Grail is housed and serves as a chalice at the celebration of the Mass, in which the whole company participate, and which becomes known as the Mass of the Grail. In other versions, Joseph goes no further than Europe, and the guardianship of the cup passes to Braun, who becomes known as the Rich Fisher, after he miraculously feeds the company from it with a single fish, echoing Christ's feeding of the 5,000. The company settles at a place called Averon, perhaps the same as Avalon, the Celtic name for the otherworld, also identified with Glastonbury, to await the coming of the third Grail keeper, Alain. A temple is built on Mont Salvache, the mountain of salvation, to house the vessel, and an order of Grail Knights comes into being. They sit at a second table and partake of a sacred feast provided by the Grail. A form of Mass also takes place at which the Grail keeper, now called king, serves as priest. Shortly after, he receives a mysterious wound, variously said to be in the thighs or the genitals, caused by a spear and attributed to one of several different causes, among which are the loss of faith, the love of a woman against a vow of chastity, or an accidental blow struck by a stranger in self-defense. Hereafter, the guardian is known as the Maimed or Wounded King, and the country around the Grail Castle becomes barren and is called the Wasteland, a state explicitly connected with the Grail King's wound. The spear with which he is struck becomes identified with the lance of Longinus, the Roman soldier who in biblical tradition pierced the side of Christ on the cross. This spear, the Grail, a sword, and a dish-shaped platter, which in more primitive versions of the story may have borne a human head, and which later becomes confused with the Grail itself, constitute the objects, called hallows, to be found in the Grail Castle. By this time we have reached the age of Arthur, and the scene is set for the beginning of the quest. The Round Table is established by Merlin the Enchanter as the third table, from which the Grail itself is, however, absent, and a fellowship of knights led by Arthur meet around it, bound by the rules of chivalry. At Pentecost the Grail makes an appearance, floating veiled in a beam of sunlight, and the knights pledge themselves to go in search of it. There follow a series of initiatory adventures involving most of the fellowship, especially Lancelot, Gawain, and Bors. Two others, Perceval, Parzival, nicknamed the Perfect Fool in token of his innocence, and Lancelot's son Galahad, who is from the beginning singled out for special significance by being permitted to sit unscathed in the Siège Perilous, are given particular emphasis, their adventures forming the greater part of the narrative from this point. Of the many who set out from the Arthurian court at Camelot, few catch more than a glimpse of the elusive Grail. A series of tests are set for each knight, and their nature explained by a succession of hermit figures who are always at hand in the deep wood where the questers often find themselves. Lancelot comes agonizingly close to the holy vessel, but is turned away, temporarily blinded, because of his adulterous love for Arthur's queen. Gawain reaches the Grail Castle, but fails, as it is his nature to fail, being too much in the world and without the simplicity or the spiritual qualities required of the true quester. Only 3 succeed in finding the Grail and participating, to varying degrees, in its mystery. They are Galahad, the stainless virgin knight, Perceval, the holy fool, and Bors, the humble, ordinary man who is the only one of the 3 to return to Camelot with news of the quest. Perceval, after first failing and wandering for 5 years in the wilderness, finds his way again to the castle of the wounded king, who is sometimes his uncle, as well as the Fisher King, the guardian of the way to the wasteland, and by asking a ritual question, usually, "Whom does the Grail serve?" brings about his healing. The answer, never explicitly stated, is the king himself, who is kept alive, though in torment from his wound, beyond his normal lifespan. Once healed, the king is permitted to die, and the waters of the wasteland flow again, making it flower. Galahad, Perceval, and Bors continue their journey, eventually reaching Sarras, perhaps a corruption of Montsalvache, the heavenly city in the east, where the final mysteries of the Grail are celebrated and where the 3 knights take part in a mass, in which the vessel is again used as the chalice. Christ appears first as celebrant and then as a radiant child, and finally in the host as a crucified man. After this, Galahad dies in an odor of sanctity, and the Grail is taken up into heaven. Perceval goes back to the Fisher King's castle to rule in his place, leaving Bors to return alone to Camelot. Given the length of time, about 150 years, which spans the formation of this story, it is amazing that such a consistent body of myths should have evolved around the symbol. Origin, history, development, and final disappearance are there in detail, and though there are contradictions in the form taken by the vessel, there are few in the history of its time in the world. And this is an important clue to the nature of the Grail as a symbol, and to how it was understood by those who told of its existence. At no time, however, did the established church make any reference to what was clearly an important and widely recognized object, either to confirm or to deny its existence. This, in an age of relic hunting, is more than just unusual. Why did the Church Fathers keep silent? It may have been because they knew that the Grail was associated by some with heresy, and that there may even have been an attempt to form a second church with the Grail as its central symbol. Or they may have recognized the borrowings to be from other non-Christian sources. Whatever the reason, they maintained their silence. This may have helped foster the image of a secret cult of the Grail, but the fact that they did not denounce it prevented it from becoming the cause of speculation. Perhaps they believed that, with the stamping out of the Cathar heresy in southern France, with which, as we shall see, the Grail had strong links, the matter would die out on its own. Its refusal to do so is evidenced by the continuing strengths of the tradition. Yet its origins remain obscure, confused by the many different interpretations to which the symbol has been subject. At the beginning of the 12th century, hardly anyone had heard of the Grail. By the end of the 13th century, there could be few who had not. Yet the literature on the holy vessel occurred with such apparent suddenness that one can only assume it was giving shape to an already well-defined body of oral myths. The reasons for this become apparent only when the symbol is viewed in a broader spectrum, by considering the history of the sacred vessel as a symbol, of which the Grail was only the latest manifestation. The legend, its origins and development. The symbol of the sacred vessel as an object of power and as the cause of miraculous events is at least as old as history. It stems from the roots of the human psyche and appears in the earliest shapes painted on cave walls by the first men. Behind it lies the concept of the circle, which can contain all being, life itself in its circular journey from birth to death. Perhaps this concept is the basis, too, for the cup and ring markings traced on standing stones and burial mounds throughout the ancient world, made by the same people who constructed their graves in the shape of a reclining woman, through whose womb they would enter at death, as in the prehistoric houses of Malta, and their temples in the form of a circle. From the earliest times, people have seen the sky as an upturned bowl covering the earth, and the sun and moon as filled with liquors of the gods. Sometimes heroes partook of these divine beverages served in rich vessels, thereby endowing themselves with untold strength and endless life, often after a quest involving supernatural adventures and encounters with the gods and goddesses within whose realm these objects lay. Or else the gods themselves were seen to perform miracles with them, like those done long after in the name of the Grail. An instance of this is the story of the Vedic god Indra, who stole the fire of the sun and the divine drink Soma from the moon, and who carried a spear with which he brought fertility to the dry land. In the Grail stories, the lance or spear was of particular significance, and Indra's action, a freeing of the waters, is like that of Perceval, who, when he heals the wounded king, causes streams and rivers to flow again. It is also believed that when the Vedic peoples inhabited a colder region of the world, Indra was known as the god who caused the thaw and brought spring, which may help to explain why, in one version, the Grail King's wound, healed by the touch of the spear, is said to have been made more unendurable by the frost which gripped the land. In Greek philosophy, the idea of the vessel was present in the form of the krater, or cup, which stood for the matrix of creation, the divine mixing bowl into which the deity poured the elements of life, and which was offered to newly created souls that they might imbibe intelligence and wisdom. Plato mentions a Vulcan krater, a fiery cup in which was mixed the light of the sun, and in his Psychogony refers to two other vessels, in one of which the deity mixed the all-soul of universal nature, and from the other ladled out the minds of men. Elsewhere, Plato says that through drinking from the krater, the soul is dragged back into a body, hurried on by new intoxication, desiring to taste a fresh draught of the overflow of matter, whereby it is weighed down and brought back to earth. G.R.S. Mead, in his study of the Orphic Mysteries, relates these vessels to the cup of Dionysus, from which inspiration came, and says that Orpheus ranges many other such cups around the solar table, which according to Orphic cosmology was the center and beginning of the universe. Mead adds that this means that the various spheres were each in turn cups containing the essence of creation, so that here we have a vessel conceived as a cosmic container and as a prefiguring of the round table at which the Grail was later to appear. To the Celtic races, the vessel was the cauldron, of rebirth, of inspiration, or of plenty, and as such it was a familiar concept. Hell itself, Anoan, had such a vessel, in which the dead, dipped head first, were returned to life, though bereft of speech. Arthur himself, who appears in an early version of the Grail story in a more heroic guise, was said to have gone in search of it, entering the fortress of the Turning Door, where it was kept, just as the Grail King, Nasciens, who also figures in the earlier stories, finds himself carried by invisible hands to a turning island where the Grail appears to him. Like his knights in later versions, Arthur and his men apparently returned empty-handed and somewhat reduced in numbers, except 7 none returned from Caer Sidi. Says the poem, Praed do Anoan, the spoils of Anoan, which tells the story. Other owners of magical or wonder-working vessels in Celtic sources include the Irish Dagda, or Father of the Gods, who possesses a cauldron which will only cook food for a hero. The food of a coward would never be in it, and which, like the Grail, serves food to an assembly of warriors. In Wales, the gods Bran, the Blessed, and Matholich possessed similar objects, while another figure, Gwyddno Garanhir, owned a basket which, if filled with enough food for one, on being opened would be found to contain enough for 100. Of these 3, Bran is an early type of wounded king, struck with a spear which causes a wound which does not heal, and his name is echoed by that of Bran, the rich fisher. Another, even more famous cauldron belonged to the Welsh goddess Ceridwen, in which she brewed a dark drink for her malformed son Avagdu, to instill him with knowledge. By chance it was Gwion her servant, who, while he was stirring the cauldron, tasted 3 drops that fell onto his hand. After a series of metamorphoses into animal forms, he was finally reborn as Taliesin, the Radiant Brow, and became chief bard of the island of Britain, possessing all knowledge through the agency of the cauldron. It is possible to see behind the story of Taliesin echoes of a mystery religion in which a sacred vessel played an important part, perhaps like the ritual depicted on the walls of the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii, 2nd century AD, where the initiate was offered a cup prior to undergoing tests which, if successfully completed, would impart to him the tenets of the inner life. Perhaps Taliesin was given such a drink, and what follows is a symbolic description of the journey towards initiation. This initiation process occurs again in the Eleusinian Mysteries. As well as a mystical feast echoing that partaken of by the Grail Knights, there was a sacred vessel, the Kernos, which contained an initiatory drink, and whose form was that of a central bowl with several smaller cups attached to it. These were supposed to contain the essential ingredients of the sacred drink, a concept very like that of the Greek krater already discussed. At Eleusis, as in most other mystery religions, the keynote was of passage, during a trance from this world into another, paradisal sphere, in which lay delight and healing for the soul, hitherto divided by its sojourn in the physical world. It is here, perhaps, that the second great strand in the history of the Grail comes into being, for behind the medieval stories lie not only the ancient myths of the rape of the sun vessel, as in the story of Indra, or the creation of the cosmos in the krater of the gods, not only the search for knowledge and truth, but also the eternal quest for paradise, where all secrets will be revealed, and the pains and sorrows of life washed away. The Grail, the cauldron of Ceridwen, the krater, and the bowl and cups of the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries were all gateways to paradise, whether Christian or pagan, and it was in paradise that they were to be found. An amalgam of many things gave rise to the symbol of the Grail. Traces of alchemical lore and classical myth, of Arabic poetry and Sufi teaching, of Celtic mythology and Christian iconography are all to be found in the final image. There is no single avenue of transmission. The most satisfactory explanation of its development is that the ancient symbol of the vessel and the myths and legends which surrounded it coalesced around the Christian image of the chalice and through that with the cup of the Last Supper. This is borne out by the earliest Grail text to have survived, Chrétien de Troyes' Conte del Graal, composed towards the end of the 12th century. Here we have the theme of quest, the adventure which leads to the castle of the wounded king, where a procession of youths and maidens carries an object called a graal, literally dish, through the hall. Nothing more is told of it than this. It is certainly not a holy relic, and there is no mention of Christ's blood or of the Mass. But Chrétien left the story unfinished when he died, and the mystery to be solved by a succession of followers who wrote continuations of the conte, always adding and elaborating until the various endings ran to several times the length of the original story. Robert de Boron was the next writer to add significantly to the corpus, and by the time his Joseph d'Arimathie, Joseph of Arimathea, the first of a projected trilogy, appeared in about 1190, the Grail had become firmly identified as the cup of the Last Supper, and the vessel in which Christ's blood had been caught. De Boron, who, despite his name, was English, seems to have drawn on the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus and Acts of Pilate for much of his material, in particular for the events concerning the imprisonment of Joseph, his miraculous survival, and his departure to spread the teachings of Christ abroad. There already seems to have existed a tradition which credited Joseph with the possession of certain teachings not made available even to the apostles, and a suspicion that he may have been expelled from the Christianized Roman Empire of Vespasian for attempting to teach these mysteries. This may even be the real reason for the Church's later silence about the Grail. As the temporal power of the Church was given into the hands of Peter, so the spiritual nature of Christ's teachings became enshrined in the cup that was given to Joseph. It was known that he had come west to Britain and had founded a church at Glastonbury dedicated to the Virgin Mary. But by the time the Grail romances were being written, Mary herself had been drawn into the story, and there may have been many willing to believe in a secret church of the Grail, founded by Joseph and continuing to flourish alongside the established church. With de Boron, the theme of the story changed. No longer was the object of the quest merely to heal the wounded king and the wasteland. A fascination with the blood in the cup led away from the Fisher King, now symbolically identified with Christ, towards the cup of the Passion. In the medieval mind, Christ's blood contained both the soul and possibly even the divinity of the Savior. It possessed unlimited powers of healing, and it was a means of transmitting a direct apprehension of God, a spiritual essence, and one which was beyond price. Illustrations exist which show the heart of Christ marked with the stigmata of his 5 wounds, letting forth blood and water. The blood, which being symbolically shed for all men, was also seen as an individual life-giving source. Other iconographical sources represent Christ in the winepress, recalling his statement, "I am the true vine," and depicting the blood spurting forth to feed the multitude of Christian believers. When one realizes that behind the word sang Grail, used by the later romancers, lie the words sang Grail, Holy Grail, and sang Real, royal blood, one can see how easily the life-giving properties of the blood could be extended to include the cup in which it had been carried. This may well account for the association of the Grail with the chalice of the Mass, and it is interesting that it was during the period when the Grail was most active in people's imagination that the host, hitherto kept hidden during the celebration of the Eucharist, was first openly elevated. It is almost as though one mystery replaced the other, that when the secret of the Mass was made open to all, the Grail took its place as a more profound celebration. Nor should we forget the custom, also current, of reserving the host, previously blessed and kept in a special container, for later distribution in private houses and castles where there was no resident priest. The element of wonder, the closed box, perhaps made of precious metal and kept in a lonely castle, could have recalled the stones at the Grail. Robert de Boron claimed that his Joseph had been given to him by an angel, or even by Christ himself in the form of a book which later disappeared, and by this claim to divine inspiration established an aura of authenticity in his work and strengthened its links with Christian dogma. But it was the writers of the great compilation known as the Quête del Saint Graal, the Vulgate cycle, finished in 1210, who completed the transformation from the mysterious object introduced by Chrétien into a fully fledged Christian symbol. Chronicling the history of the Grail from Joseph of Arimathea to its final departure for Sarras and beyond, the compilers of the Quête, probably Cistercian clerks from one of the large monasteries in France, patiently interpreted the symbolism of the Grail in the language and terminology of the Church. They also brought onto the scene a new character. Probably one of the most important events in the literary history of the Grail was the creation of Galahad, the virgin knight destined from birth to achieve the quest. Before him, Perceval represented the ordinary man's search for the supreme mystery, but Galahad is far from being an ordinary man. Indeed, he scarcely seems like a human being at all, so total is his spirituality. He lives on the borderland between the earthly and the divine, and is in some senses a bridge between this world and the next. Lancelot, his father, is the best knight in the world, the perfect representation of the chivalric ideal, yet Lancelot is flawed because he loves his lord's wife. He is the product of amour courtois, courtly love. Courtly love has its place in the history of the Grail for several reasons. As a civilizing force, it drew inspiration from women, hitherto virtually ignored in the culture of the Middle Ages, drawing freely on the sentiments expressed in Arabic poetry and song, as well as on the teachings of the Sufi mystics whose beliefs included idealized earthly love as a means to spiritual perfection. Courtly love placed woman on a pedestal for the first time in that age, worshipped her as a goddess, revered her as an almost sacred object of devotion, and in so doing touched off a spark in the poetic consciousness which resulted in a flood of lyricism and song. The troubadours, singers and poets who celebrated the art of courtly love in all its aspects, became a dominant force in Western culture. Love became a faith to live by, a code second only to that of chivalry, with which it was closely linked. A complex set of laws ruled every act of courtship made by the knight for love of his lady, who was always portrayed as aloof, cold of heart, and lacking in charity, and who humbled her worshipper with cruel words, only spurring him on to greater efforts to please her. Though never classed as a heresy, courtly love was clearly frowned upon by the Church, especially because of the rule contained in it which decreed that the most perfect relationship between a knight and a lady was when the lady was already married. Chrétien de Troyes' most famous work before the Comte del Graal was a long poem called The Knight of the Cart, which introduced Lancelot as a major figure in the Arthurian cycle and made him the lover of Queen Guinevere, not only the wife of Arthur, but a perfect type of courtly lady. One of the authors of the Quête decided that Lancelot's sin should be redeemed at the cost of his personal failure in the quest for the Grail. In the Quête, Lancelot is tricked into making love to the Grail King's daughter because he thinks she is Guinevere. The result is the birth of Galahad, the perfect knight in both the spiritual and temporal sense. From Lancelot's sin is born the one who will achieve the Grail and redeem the wasteland, the virgin knight who will have nothing to do with women. The courtly ethic reversed. Lancelot is reborn in his son as spiritually superior man, and from this moment the Grail myth is inextricably bound up with the idea of redemption. Galahad becomes a symbol of Christ as man, as distinct from Christ as Savior, symbolized by the Grail. After this, though many more texts were to be written, most were little more than reworkings or compilations of the original material. The basic pattern had been laid down, and of the three major works that remained to be discussed, only one added significantly to the shape of the stories. This work, completed by 1207, is the Perceval of Wolfram von Eschenbach, and it displays the most individual and personal approach to the Grail myth yet. Wolfram is the most consistent and obvious borrower from Eastern sources, to which he clearly had considerable access, and he was a mystic who possessed a remarkable insight into the nature of the Grail. We shall look at his work more fully in the context of its references to alchemy. The only really significant medieval text to succeed Wolfram were the anonymous Perceval, circa 1225, and Sir Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur, printed by Caxton in 1485. Perceval reaches an extreme of Christian mysticism not attained even by the Ket, and demands a more thorough study than it has yet received. In particular, there is the mysterious statement that the Grail undergoes 5 changes of shape, of which only the 5th, a chalice, is named. Malory, who is the last of the true medieval romancers, wrote what is probably the most famous Arthurian work. But his concerns were different to those of his predecessors, his interests more with the code of chivalry than with the mysticism of the Grail. His book of the Sang Real, though finely written, is little more than a parade of half-understood symbols. The drama has passed to the human characters. It is the failure of Lancelot we remember, rather than the success of Galahad. With Malory, the literary history of the Grail was virtually at an end. From the dawn of the Renaissance onwards, there was less interest in the mystical lore which surrounded the sacred cup, though the study of alchemy continued to grow and, in its own way, kept alive the concept of the vessel. What remains to be considered in detail is the role played by the Grail in the history and beliefs of the Middle Ages, through which, often dark and confused time, it shines like a brilliant star. The Maiden Makeless, Mary and the Grail. Parallel to the flowering in Europe of the idea of courtly love, and subtly connected with it, was the emergence of a cult of the Virgin Mary. Reverence for the Mother of God had always been more pronounced among Eastern Christians, but it was not until the Crusades returning from the Holy Land at the end of the 11th century brought with them ideas which strengthened the belief that Mary began to develop a real following in the West. Worship of womankind, extolled by the new breed of troubadours, encouraged the pious to place Christ's mother even higher than before, so high that in some areas her cult began to attract more followers than her sons. Shrines to the Virgin sprang up across Europe, and the great abbeys vied with each other for the splendors of their Marian shrines. Britain took the lead over the rest of Europe in this, for as everyone knew, Joseph of Arimathea had built the first Christian church there, and Christ himself, appearing in a vision, had dedicated it to his mother, a tradition so strong that Britain is still referred to as the dowry of Mary. And with the growth of interest in the early history of the Grail, it was inevitable that a connection should be made between the story of Joseph bringing the Grail to Glastonbury and the dedication of the first church to Mary. In the Quête del Saint Graal, at the moment when Galahad enters Sarras with the Grail, the text refers to the Mass of the Mother of God being sung in the cathedral, and in both Perceval and the Mort d'Arthur there are specific references to the Mass of Our Lady being performed at the mystery of the Grail. Indeed, Perceval, which was almost certainly written at Glastonbury, states that the Virgin took the part of celebrant at the Mass and offered her son as the living sacrifice. Later, in the same text, we read that every day our service be done in the most holy chapel, where the most holy Grail every day appeared, and where the Mother of God abode from the Saturday until the Monday that the service was finished. The possibility of a Marian Grail cult at Glastonbury cannot thus be ruled out. The Tor, which dominates the surrounding area, undoubtedly has ancient links with pre-Christian religious activities. It has been suggested that there may once have been an initiatory maze cut into its sides, and if this was so, it is more than likely that the objective of the initiate having pierced the center of the maze was to imbibe a draught from a sacred vessel, which he would find there. Memories of such a rite centering around the religion of the Earth Mother could well have been revived with the appearance of the Grail romances. Ceridwen, the Welsh mother goddess figure, was herself, as we have seen, the possessor of a magic vessel and of a semi-divine son, Taliesin. Nor did the similarity between the Welsh word for cauldron, per, and the spelling of Mary's name, Mer, go unnoticed. The Welsh poet David Bentrus, who lived during the period of the Grail romances, wrote, Christ mab Mer amper pur von head, Christ, son of Mary, my cauldron of pure descent. Here we possess a clue to the association of Mary with the Grail. In the medieval litany of Loretto, the Virgin is described as vas spirituale, spiritual vessel, vas honorabile, vessel of honor, vas insigne devotionis, singular vessel of devotion, referring to Mary as the vessel, womb, in which divinity had become manifest. In effect, Mary becomes a living Grail, containing the blood and the spiritual essence of Christ. The litany makes this point even more strongly in making the Virgin causa nostrae laetitiae, cause of our joy, federis arca, ark of the covenant, turis Davidica, tower of David, turis ebornea, tower of ivory, domus aurea, house of gold, sede sapientiae, seat of wisdom, speculum justitiae, mirror of justice, regina prophetarum, queen of prophets. For the Grail too was a vessel of spirit and devotion, as it was also a cause of joy among those who came into its presence, as well as being the ark of a new covenant. It was also associated with a house of gold, the Grail temple, and with a chair, the siège perilous, while in Perceval it has a prophetic quality through the messages which appear written upon it. In the full spectrum of medieval symbolism, Mary is Queen of Heaven, as well as mirror, vessel, house of gold, and star of the sea, seat of wisdom and cause of joy. But her supreme symbol is the rose, rose of the world, rosa alchemica, queen of the most holy rose garden, multifoliate rose. The rosary, signifying devotion to the mother of the divine child, is arranged in multiples of 5. 5 decades, tens, repeated 3 times, totaling 15 decades. 5 was thus the number of Marian devotion. The rose was always depicted with 5 petals. Christ was wounded 5 times, and the Grail underwent 5 changes. And in the elaborate symbolism of courtly love, the rose garden becomes the place where the beloved, the lady, the goddess of love herself, awaits the coming of the lover, who must pick the rose to achieve his desire. Dante, who fully understood the richness of the symbol, in his Paradiso makes the rose the image of the final revelation, granted him at the behest of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who prays for the intercession of the Virgin. For both sacred and profane, the symbol holds good. Mary, the Theotokos, or God-bearer, is the vessel destined to contain the Spirit made flesh. With this becoming, God enters the world. In the sacrament, he consents to become bread and wine. The Grail, which contains these elements, thus becomes, like the womb of Mary, a house of God, and a symbol of self-fulfillment in man. As St. Ephrem wrote in the 4th century, invoking Christ, "In the womb that bore you are fire and spirit. Fire and spirit are in the river where you were baptized. Fire and spirit are in our baptism too. And in the bread and cup are fire and spirit." And again, Mary has given us the bread of rest, in place of the bread of toil which Eve provided, the harp of the Spirit. Mary redeemed the sin of Eve as Christ redeemed the sin of Adam. New light and life is contained in the Grail as chalice, and in this image it is at its most sacramental, a hallow of mankind. In imagery such as this, we find the troubadours addressing Mary as Grail of the world, and applying the term with equal validity to the Lady of the Rose Garden. The beloved one is the heart's Grail. Her lover will not be alone, for she is to him the highest Grail which protects from every woe. When Mary asked at the time of the Annunciation, "How may these things be?" she is almost foreshadowing the question of the Grail seeker, who must ask, "Who is it the Grail serves?" The who and the how are interchangeable, and the answer to both questions is Christ, as the Fisher King and as the Messiah. Mary, too, serves God, and through her Son, mankind. As Angelus Silesius said, man must become Mary and bear God from within, before he can win truth and wisdom, just as the Grail seeker must achieve his quest in order to attain the same goals. Joseph of Arimathea, who built the first Marian shrine and perhaps placed the Grail on an altar within it, shared the title Paranymphos, friend of the bride, with St. John, and also shared the responsibility for the guardianship of the Mother of God. In this way, it may be that from being the guardian of the vessel of the Holy Spirit, Joseph became the guardian of another vessel, the Grail. In looking at the idea behind the symbol, we seem to catch a glimpse of a dual-natured Grail figure. On the one hand, the Virgin Mother, and on the other, the Grail King, who is a type of Christ. In fact, almost a uniting of Christ and Mary. It is as though, like the androgynous figures of alchemy, they represent the nature of God as a duality, male and female, anima and animus, contained within a single image of wholeness, the Grail. The stone vessel, the Grail in alchemy. In Perceval, the Grail is described not as a cup, but as a stone of the purest kind, called lapsit exilas. There never was human so ill but that if he one day sees that stone, he cannot die within the week that follows. And though he should see the stone for 200 years, his appearance will never change, save that his hair might perhaps turn gray. This description has always puzzled scholars, and various attempts have been made to suggest what Wolfram meant by lapsit exilas. Did he perhaps mean to write lapis lapsus ex caelis, the stone fallen from heaven? This would seem to be borne out by a further statement in Perceval that the stone was a jewel, an emerald which fell from the crown of Lucifer during the war between God and Satan, and which was brought to earth by angels who remained neutral. Some translators interpret the emerald as being from Lucifer's forehead rather than his crown, and have linked this with the pearl fixed in the brow of the Indian god Shiva. Called the urna, this stone signified the sense of eternity belonging to the god, and is like the third eye with which one may see inward to knowledge and perfection. Thus, without the emerald, Lucifer is doomed to inhabit the earth as a manifestation of evil, while the stone itself becomes a fallen image which can be raised up only by the Grail quest and redeemed in the act of healing performed by Perceval in its name. This sounds remarkably like some of the processes of alchemy, and in fact the most generally accepted derivation of Wolfram's pure stone is that it is a more or less direct reference to the lapis philosophorum, or philosopher's stone, the quest for which involved the minds and energies of the medieval alchemists almost to the exclusion of everything else. In spite of the fascination it exerted, the lapis was regarded merely as a stage in the process known as the Great Work, in which they were all involved to a lesser or greater degree. The work itself was concerned primarily with transformation of the base elements earth, water, air, and fire into higher states of being, and in terms of the spirit, the baser elements in man into similarly higher realms. The part played by the lapis was that of a catalyst, and its creation was the first major step along the path towards realizing the highest aims of the work, the spiritual perfection of the alchemist and his joining with God. One of the greatest alchemists of the day, Arnold of Villanova, referred to the lapis in his Rosarium Philosophorum, written not long after Wolfram's Perceval. Hic lapis exilis extat precio quoque vilis. Spernitur astultis amator plus ab edoctis. This insignificant stone is indeed of trifling value. It is despised by fools, the more cherished by the wise. This deliberately contradictory attitude is typical of the way in which the lapis was described. But what is interesting here is the echo in the phrase lapis exilis, insignificant stone, of Wolfram's description of the Grail stone as exilas, which probably means the same thing. The fact that he also says it was an emerald recalls the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, the semi-mythical founder of alchemy, on which were inscribed the first precepts of the work. The whole process of the great work was carried out in the greatest secrecy and in constant fear of denouncement for heresy or witchcraft. To disguise their activities further, the alchemists devised a detailed system of symbolism in which the various elements received the names or titles of gods and goddesses, and sometimes their personalities as well. It is possible indeed that Wolfram learned some of this symbolism and carried it over into his poem without fully understanding it, as when he says that the power of the Grail stone is the same as that which enables the phoenix to immolate itself and be reborn from its own ashes. The phoenix was frequently used as a symbol of the lapis and was depicted as hovering over it. It is also a symbol of transfiguration in its own right, and like the Grail, stands for spiritual renewal. That these same spiritual qualities were subject to even wider application in terms of symbolic reference is evidenced by passages from the Aurora Consurgens, an alchemical work attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas. Here the lapis is described as a treasure house founded upon a sure rock, which cannot be split unless it be smitten 3 times with the rod of Moses, that waters may flow forth in great abundance, that all men and women may drink thereof. The imagery recalls the wounding of Christ, whose side gave forth blood and water, which were caught in the Grail, and is the reverse of the episode of the wounded king, whose hurt causes the waters of the land to dry up. Aquinas may also have been thinking of the legend of the rock used to seal Christ's tomb, which has been linked with the rock struck by Moses to bring forth water to feed the thirsty Israelites in the wilderness, an act transferred to Perceval in the Grail story, when he frees the waters by healing the wounded king. More important still is Aquinas' statement that the stone is an allegory for the soul of Mary. He had already written that the lapis was rightly called the stone of chastity, recalling the Arabic alchemist Alphidius, who taught that the lapis's mother was virginal as well as Wolfram's pure stone. Now he says that it is ever the same and ever constant and without flaw, making an additional case for the Marian Grail symbolism examined above. But the lapis is not the only object of alchemical origin which has a bearing on the history of the Grail. There is the hermetic vessel, the vas mirabile, in which the basic elements of the great work were mixed, as were the elements of creation in the Greek krater and the kernos of Eleusis. According to C.G. Jung, in his study of alchemy, the semi-mythical writer Maria Prophetissa said that the whole secret of the great work lies in knowing about the hermetic vessel. From it was born the Filius Philosophorum, son of the philosophers, the mysterious child which in alchemical symbolism stood for the birth of wisdom from the vas, the uterus of the work, the uterine nature of the vas, and by extension the Grail, Mary's womb being thus emphasized. The idea is even more fascinating when considered along with the suggestion that Wolfram's lapsit exilas reflects the words lapis exulis, stone of exile, used by Kabbalists to signify the Shekhinah, the divine manifestation of God in the material world. The Shekhinah is the tabernacle of the heart, and the heart is the wounded center of the cup, which contains the wounds of God and is his dwelling place in the divine blood of the sacrament. Like the exiled stone, the Shekhinah is willingly exiled from Eden along with Adam, the presence of God going with and in him into the outside world. There is a suggestion here of the deep-rooted urge to discover the Grail and to return with it, as did Galahad to Saras, the heavenly city which is like paradise. Returning to the pure stone of Wolfram, the fact that it could be interpreted as the stone fallen from heaven is particularly interesting in the light of a further instance of alchemical symbolism, in which the lapis was identified with the stone of Saturn. According to the myth, Saturn vomited forth the stone after mistakenly swallowing it instead of his son Jupiter. This was seen by the alchemists as a symbol of the divine nature of the lapis, and of its baser origin as something cast aside by the god. In other words, the despised stone which had its beginning in the base elements. The stone of Saturn came to rest on Mount Helicon, the holy mountain of Greece, thus becoming a stone from heaven, which lay beyond the reach of all but a few on top of a mountain rising from the sea, precisely the imagery of the Grail. But there is still another stone that could have influenced Wolfram's conception of the Grail. This is the black stone, sacred to the Islamic religion, which stands at the center of Mecca, and towards which the faithful offer daily prayers from whatever part of the world they happen to be in. Like the emerald which fell to earth, the black stone was believed to have been a meteorite which fell out of the sky in the distant past. It became an object of worship until the time of Muhammad, who denounced its use as such and declared that it should be used as a source of communication with God. According to Quranic sources, it was said to have been given to Ishmael by the angel Gabriel at the time of the rebuilding of the Kaaba, or cubic house, where the stone was afterwards kept. In earlier times, it was said to have represented the triple-aspected mother goddess, the Mater Dea, who, with the god Hubal, was offered sacrifices of blood, a fact which becomes significant when considered in connection with the Grail. Interestingly, the color green attributed by Wolfram to the Grail stone is associated with Venus, whose day, Friday, is the Islamic Sabbath. Green is also the color associated with the prophet, and is therefore sacred. Like the lapis philosophorum and the black stone, the Grail was an object of supernatural origin, an activity involving the prolonging of life, the birth of a divine child, the quest for wisdom and knowledge and direct communication with God. That the stone was perfectly capable of supporting such a wide spectrum of interpretations is further demonstrated by the way it is used in biblical sources. In the story of Jacob, for example, who falls asleep with his head pillowed on a stone and dreams of a ladder leading directly to heaven, it is clear. And in the book of Revelation 2:17 is written, "To him who conquers I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone, calculum candidum, with a new name written on the stone which no one knows except him who receives it. The new name is that individual wholeness attained only by him who completes the great work, or wins the Grail. It is the key to fulfillment." The Temple of the Mysteries. The home of the Grail is properly in the uncharted country of the soul, but within the framework of the stories, an externalized form, the temple or castle of the Grail, came to be recognized as the place where, if the quester should reach it, he might find the object of his search. And because such a place must have its guardians, there came into being an order of Grail knights, a king and a court, conforming to the medieval idea of such a place, but at the same time as remote and mysterious as the ritual object thus housed. The name of the Grail King and of his castle vary from text to text, but most are in agreement as to its setting at the summit of a mountain, usually surrounded by water, and as to the name of this mountain, Mont Salvage, the mountain of salvation. Inevitably, attempts were made to identify the site, and though there does not seem to have been an actual Mont Salvage, there were several contenders. Of these, the most generally accepted is a mountain fortress in the Languedoc area of southern France. The name of this fortress, Montségur, and its history, together with that of the surrounding country, did much to establish it in the minds of medieval readers of the Grail stories as a site for the home of the Holy Vessel. The events which brought about this identification worked in two ways. The Grail castle or temple acquired a foothold in the real world, and at the same time, the Grail itself became associated with a heretical sect known as the Albigensians, named after the town of Albi, where they were supposed to have originated, but who referred to themselves as Cathari, the pure. The ultimate origins of the Cathars are obscure, though they are known to have inherited certain doctrines from Manichaeism. This sect was founded in about AD 61 and was based on the archaic Persian religion of Mazdaism, expounded in the teachings of Zoroaster in the 6th century BC, whose own life was a perpetual striving after perfection. But the Cathar movement itself arose from within the established church, separating itself from the main body with an elitism borne out by its choice of name. Its beliefs were of a dualistic nature, stemming from the idea that God had remained aloof from creation, actually brought about by Lucifer, giving only a fragment of himself to man, which subsequently became trapped in matter. The Cathars, like their Gnostic predecessors, saw this as a betrayal to them. Man was already dead. The fall was into the death of the spirit, and this had not been redeemed by the suffering of Christ, though he had come as a reminder of man's true state, and his relics, such as the Grail, were held to be sacred. But the Cathars desired to return to the world of light from which they felt they had been separated, and did not believe this could be achieved through ordinary means, such as those offered by the Church. They sought, rather, their own way, which was rigorously hard and entailed abjuring the flesh, fasting, and living a pure life. Their priests, called perfecti, perfect ones, strove to reach the highest form of spiritual life, and in so doing aligned themselves with the Grail Knights, whose way of life was also exemplary and required that they remain pure in body and mind. In both the Cathar movement and the Grail quest lies the image of a company whose way of life, in reflecting the ideal of Christianity, was far removed from the state of affairs in the real world. The corrupt administration and openly displayed riches of the Church led many people to join the Cathar movement, beginning with the literate classes who were already reading the Grail romances. Gradually, as the Cathar priests went out among the ordinary people, here too their teachings found a firm hold. Catharism, with its insistence on the responsibility of every man for his own soul, must have seemed a bright alternative to the Church's doctrine of original sin. The people were being offered a new kind of freedom, that of the spirit, and they were not slow to respond. In Languedoc and Provence, culturally the most advanced areas in the Western world at that time, the new movement flourished. Here the courts were both richer and far more splendid than those of their austere northern neighbors, and the flowering of poetry, philosophy, and music was the object of envy on every side. The troubadours, who, as we have seen, provided the Grail stories with some of their most potent imagery, through the cult of courtly love, almost certainly originated in this area, and one cannot help but compare the kiss bestowed by the courtly lover on his lady with the kiss of the consolamentum, almost the only rite permitted by the Cathars, as a means of transmitting light from one to the other. So legendary were the wealth and splendor of the southern kingdoms that Philip II of France began to look askance at his neighbor. He needed only an excuse to invade, and it was given to him finally by Pope Innocent III, who in 1208 preached a holy war against the Albigensians, and set in motion one of the bloodiest crusades ever. By its end, the culture of Languedoc and Provence had been swept away. The leaders and priests of the Cathars burned at the stake with hundreds of their followers. They might have been forgotten but for the fact that they left behind them a series of legends which grew with the telling. One of these concerned Montségur, which had become, towards the end of the Crusades, one of the last strongholds of the southern forces, a bastion of Cathar strength which refused to fall victim to the Crusaders. It was said that during the siege of the fortress, one of the Cathar knights appeared on the walls wearing a suit of pure white armor, and that the besiegers fled in the belief that he was a knight of the Grail who had come against them. This was only one of the stories which linked the Grail with the Cathars, and with Montségur in particular. It was known that the only other ritual allowed by the Prefecti apart from the consalamentum was a kind of mystical feast known as the Manisola. This seems to have been the same kind of event as when the Grail passed among the knights who served it, and provided them with both literal and spiritual food. Montsalvache, the Grail mountain, was ruled over by a mysterious figure, the Fisher King. Montségur, the Cathar citadel, had as its châtelaine Esclamonde of Foix, a woman reputed to be of such spirituality and goodness that even her enemies held her in respect, and who when she died refused to believe it, but held that in fact she slept in one of the caves that riddled the mountain beneath her stronghold. It was rumored also that among the great treasures smuggled out of the fortress before it eventually surrendered was a certain rich cup, said to have been used at the Manisola. Whatever the truth of this, the Cathar treasure was never recovered. It vanished into the caves below Montségur, one of which at least is reputed to have the carving of a chalice on its walls. How much of this was in the mind of Wolfram von Eschenbach when he came to write his Grail story is impossible to say, though it has been suggested that he may have been a Cathar himself. However, what is interesting is the source he claimed to be the origin of his book. He said that he had found the matter of Perceval in a manuscript written in Arabic by a Jewish astronomer of Toledo named Phlegetanis, and that this work had been given to him by a Provençal chanteur, singer, named Coit. This elusive figure, of whom Wolfram tells us nothing more, has so far resisted all attempts at identification, and is generally presumed to have been an invention. However, there is no reason to believe that this was so, and if Coit and his book did exist, much that is strange about Wolfram's description of the Grail is explained. Apart from the fact that Toledo, the supposed home of Coit's Jewish astronomer, was the center for alchemical activities during the period of the Grail romances, Provençal was almost synonymous with heretic, and Provence, like Languedoc, was the center of Catharism and Manichaean beliefs, and even of Sufi teachings brought from the east via Spain and the Pyrenees. Thus it is from Languedoc, if anywhere, that the eastern elements of the story entered the literature of the Grail. Wolfram, acquiring the story at a purer stage of transmission, seems to have recognized, perhaps accidentally, its mystical nature. He added his own touches, of course, perhaps even that the Grail was a stone, but carried over the influence of Eastern sources in his depiction of the world of the Grail kings. Echoes of Cathar beliefs seem to be there also, as in the neutral angels who brought the emerald to earth. Some 60 years later than Wolfram, but belonging to the same tradition, the German poet Albrecht von Scharfenberg, usually referred to simply as Albrecht, wrote a work entitled Der jüngere Titurel, the young Titurel, 1270, which deals with the early history of the Grail family, and in particular with Titurel, the grandfather of Perceval. Included in the poem are a number of verses describing the Temple of the Grail in some detail. In the land of salvation, in the forest of salvation, lies a solitary mountain called the Mountain of Salvation, which King Titurel surrounded by a wall, and on which he built a costly castle to serve as the Temple of the Grail, because the Grail at that time had no fixed place but floated invisible in the air. Albrecht goes on to describe how the mountain was of onyx, cleared of earth on the top, which was then polished until it shone like the moon. The temple was high, round, domed, and had a roof of gold. Inside, the ceiling was encrusted with sapphires to represent the blue sky, and studded with carbuncles for stars. A gold sun and a silver moon moved across the hemispheres by artificial means, and symbols were struck to indicate the passing of the canonical hours. The whole of the temple was rich in gold and encrusted with jewels. For many, this was assumed to be no more than a piece of literary artifice, until, in this century, scholars drew attention to an actual site which bore a remarkable resemblance to Albrecht's description of the Grail Temple. At the beginning of the 7th century A.D., the Persian king Khosroes II built a palace which he called the Takht-i-Takhdis, or Throne of Arches, now called Takht-i-Suleiman, on the holy mountain of Shiz in Iran. This was the most sacred spot in his whole realm, containing a sanctuary of the holy fire, and being the reputed birthplace of Zoroaster. Here, the kings of the Sasanian line, to which Khosroes belonged, held seasonal rituals to ensure the health of the land. And when the sanctuary was laid waste, the country did indeed seem to die. just as in the Grail stories the infertile state of the wasteland was seen as a direct consequence of the Grail King's symbolic death. From more or less contemporary sources, backed up by archaeological evidence, a description of the Tacht has been put together. Like the Grail Temple, it was domed, roofed with gold and lined with blue stones to represent the sky. There were stars, sun, and moon, astrological and astronomical charts outlined in jewels, balustrades covered with gold, golden staircases, and rich hangings. All resembled the Temple of the Grail. The whole structure of the Tacht was built above a hidden pit, in which teams of horses walked round and round, causing the building to revolve with the seasons and to help with the calculation of astrological and astronomical observances. This recalls the turning castles of Celtic myth, themselves often repositories for sacred objects, as well as the turning island upon which the Grail King, Nasciens, found himself as described in Robert de Boron's Joseph, written over 600 years after the Tacht had been razed to the ground. Like many descriptions of the Grail Temple, the Tacht stood beside a great lake, said to be bottomless, a dark, still sheet of water filling what had once been a volcanic crater. According to Albrecht, the Grail Temple had doors on 3 of its sides. Tachti Tachtis was approachable from only 3 directions, 2 of which echo the 13th century Welsh Grail text Peredur in the Mabinogion, one across a meadow and the other by following a stream through a valley. The fact that the Tacht was fed by 2 rivers and that it was surrounded by a wall, as well as that devices were installed to imitate the seasonal changes in weather, recalls the medieval concept of paradise, often depicted as the home of the Grail. When an expedition was mounted by the American Institute for Persian Art and Archaeology in 1937, its members discovered, at the site of the Tacht, a gleaming, crust-like deposit made by the mineral waters of the lake, which particularly around the edges where it had been exposed had taken on the appearance of onyx. Albrecht, as we have seen, also described the Grail Temple as standing on a bed of onyx. Finally, there exists in the Berlin Staatsmuseum a bronze dish dating from the Sasanian period, which depicts the Tacht, complete with the wooden rollers on which the building turned, and shows that the central area was surrounded by 22 elaborate arches, the same number as the lesser temples which surrounded the main room in Albrecht's Grail Castle. But how was Albrecht, writing in the 13th century, able to describe so exactly a pagan temple which had been destroyed centuries before? The answer is probably that he read an account of it in connection with a crucial event in Christian history, which was described in numerous works. For in the year AD 614, Chosroes, the builder of the Tacht, captured Jerusalem and carried off its most sacred relic, the true cross, returning with it to the very temple that was to be described as the home of another sacred object, the Holy Grail. Then, in 629, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius marched to Shiz, overthrew Chosroes, and tore down the Tacht, returning in triumph with the cross. This episode was much reported and continued to be written about and retold, with embellishments well into the Middle Ages, where doubtless Albrecht or some unknown predecessor discovered it and made the translation of the site from its eastern location to one in the west. What is so surprising is the comparatively short time the Tacht remained standing. In a period of no more than 30 years, it established itself as a symbol of such potency that it helped give rise to the idea of the Grail Temple, distant in both time and space. Long before Chosroes built his palace at Shiz, an ancient circular temple of the Holy Fire, worshipped by the Manichaeans, stood there, perhaps dictating the shape of the building which came after. Another similar temple of Manichaean origin was called Kuh-i-Sal Chwad-Shah, and was built on the lake of Hamun in Sistan. Ku means mountain, and the whole name is strikingly reminiscent of Mont Salvash. Both places were sacred, Kuh-i-Sal Chwad-Shah to the followers of Mani, Mont Salvash to the followers of the Grail, itself a symbol harbored on top of a mountain. Indeed, it is possible to see in the Grail legend other influences of Manichaean origin. The story of the Pearl, for example, in which a quest is undertaken by a poorly clad youth, seems to come close to the story of Perceval, also about a young hero who professes nothing. But these temples, whether of Chosroes or the Manichaeans, are not the only sources which throw light on the origin of Mont Salvash. The Japanese Buddhist stories of the mystic mountain Meru also deserve attention. Meru is sometimes depicted as a multi-tiered mountain surrounded by water around which the sun and moon revolve. Here the Buddha sits enthroned with his bodhisattvas, and the phoenix walks beneath the trees. And in another version we find the figure of the fisherman connected with the mountain, just as the rich fisher is with the Grail Castle. A bronze mirror from the treasure of Shosui in the Todaishi Monastery at Nara in Japan shows the mountain of Meru surrounded by an ocean which floats the fisherman in his boat, in this instance probably an avatar of the god Vishnu. who is sometimes known as the Golden Fish, or the Fisherman of Light. Again, he is the guardian of the sacred mountain, and is also its numen, or local spirit. Throughout all these examples, the imagery is consistently that of a sacred place where either a valuable object is kept, or else a mysterious semi-divine ruler holds sway. Most of these sacred places are ultimately identifiable as symbols of paradise, or as recollections of an ideal state of being. A story which combines these elements and which connects them with the Grail is that of the Priest-King. The Priest-King and the Grail. The quest for the Grail is also the quest for paradise. This much is clear from the imagery associated with the temple and the country which surrounds it. The Grail King, or rich fisherman, by whichever title one chooses to call him, is also a priest, for he officiates at the Mass in which the Grail is used as chalice, and he is identified with Christ, the vessel's true king. This is one of the mysteries of the Grail that sets it apart from the established church, in the same way as its avowedly mystical properties transcend the form of Christian interpretation in which it was bound by the Western romancers who put the stories in writing. Yet behind this lies much that is non-Christian in origin. The influx of ideas and culture from the East through the agency of the Crusaders and the troubadours who traveled with them, bringing back stories and songs that became outwardly Christianized, had a lasting effect on the shaping of the Grail legend. Even while this exchange was taking place, the East remained a largely unknown place, a barrier to even stranger, possibly wondrous lands beyond paradise. Understood as an actual place, was generally believed to lie either far to the west or more likely to the east, and when word began to filter through of the existence of a Christian realm beyond the lands of Islam, many believed this to be the lost Eden, the garden of earthly delights, the blessed realm where grew the tree of knowledge and where the fountain of life gushed forth. As more became known of this mysterious realm, the name of its ruler was established. He was called Prester, or Presbyter John, and he was both priest and king. A certain Bishop Hugh of Jabala first brought news of Prester John to Rome in 1145, with an account of a successful campaign made by him against the Muslims, a fact which created a considerable stir in the West, more used to hearing of defeat at the hands of the Islamic forces. But it was not until 1165 that the West became directly aware of the great Christian ruler. In that year, a letter was delivered to Pope Alexander III, which began, "Prester John, by the grace of God, king over all Christian kings, greetings to the Emperor of Rome and the King of France, our friends." It went on to describe in detail the position, the government of our land and of our people and beasts, leaving the reader in no doubt as to the splendor and importance of this hitherto unsuspected Far Eastern Christian empire. The description is certainly startling. The land is said to contain pygmies, unicorns, and the phoenix, as well as a host of even stranger creatures. Its 2 rivers are filled with jewels, and as the letter continues, in our land there is also an abundance of wine, bread, meat, and of everything that is good for the human body. And inside our palace there is water and the best wine on earth, and whoever drinks of it has no desire for worldly things, and nobody knows where the water goes or whence it comes. A statement in its details very reminiscent of the abundance of good things provided by the Grail. But the description does not end there. The letter continues, in imagery that could have come from any of the Grail romances. There is still another great marvel in our palace, for no food is served in it except in a trencher that hangs from a column, so that when we sit at table and wish to eat, the food is placed before us by the grace of the Holy Spirit. This needs only the substitution of the word Grail for trencher to coincide almost exactly with the stories we have been studying. But who was Prester John, and what was the origin of the letter? Various theories have been advanced, among them that he was Genghis Khan, or the Negus of Ethiopia, whose title, Zan, may have been mistranslated by French or Italian merchants as Jahan or Gianni, or read as Zanni, the Venetian for John. Another theory says that he was a Manichaean ruler named Ye Lu Ta Shi, who was also called Gur Khan, and who led an army against the Seljuk Sultan Sajar and gained undying fame as an oppressor of the Muslims. The truth is that Prester John shares the characteristics of all these figures, but there is little evidence to connect him with any single historical character. He seems to have made an almost spontaneous appearance, embodying the desires of the Western world for a lost paradisal state, ruled over by a benign and wise lord. There is evidence also in the form of an anonymous account written sometime after the letter that suggests a connection between Prester John and the Apostle Thomas, who is supposed to have traveled to India as a missionary not long after the crucifixion, and there founded the Nestorian Church, a breakaway sect of early Christians who established colonies first in Syria and then later in India and China. This contact with the Nestorians may also have resulted in Prester John's realm being identified with India. This anonymous account describes the visit to Rome in the year 1122 of a certain Patriarch John, and relates details of his ministry and homeland. He lives, it is said, in a great city with walls thick enough to drive 2 chariots abreast along the top of them. Through the city runs the river Fuson, which rises in paradise, and a short way beyond the walls is a mountain, on top of which stands the church of St. Thomas the Apostle. This mountain is surrounded by a lake, around the edge of which are sited 12 monasteries filled with pious monks. Only at certain times, a week before and a week after the saint's feast day, do the waters sink, permitting access to the central shrine, where hangs a silver vessel from chains in the roof. In this vessel is the uncorrupted body of the saint, which at such times is lowered from its place, and the body placed in a chair, from which position at the height of the Mass, St. Thomas himself dispenses the host from a golden dish. Those who were true believers benefited from the Eucharist, but if any heretic partook, they either repented or fell dead. This story bears so many parallels to that of the Grail that it is hard not to believe that it may have been an indirect source for details which appear in the romances. For here we have all the elements of the Grail story: the temple on top of a mountain surrounded by water, the vessel containing a sacred relic, miraculous events which take place regularly at the same time, the blessing received by those who are true adherents, and the dire effects upon those who are not. Even the 12 monasteries around the lake are reminiscent of the Round Table with its, originally, 12 seats. The vessel suspended by chains recalls the magic bowl in the Yvain story, which caused a storm when water from it was poured over an emerald, as well as the account of another very similar object to be found in the Mabinogi of Manawyddan, son of Lear. In this story, the hero, Pryderi, whom some scholars have identified with Perceval, entered a mysterious castle and there discovered a fountain with marble stone around it and a golden bowl fastened to 4 chains, the bowl set over a marble slab, and the chains extending upwards so that he could see no end to them. He walked over to the bowl and grasped it, but as soon as he did so, his hands stuck to the bowl, and his feet to the slab he was standing on, and his speech was taken so that he could not say a single word. There he stood, Math ab Mathonwy in the Mabinogion. Here once again we have an otherworld setting. The castle which Pryderi enters in search of a magic beast is an image of the Celtic paradise. Prester John's kingdom is clearly the same, being a land of plenty with rivers that divide it into 4 parts, and inhabited by a gentle Christian people, and curious beasts. Also, it contains the Tree of Life, as well as a fountain which, if one bathes in it, enables one to live 100 years, while retaining the appearance of only 32. Prester John himself says that he has bathed there 6 times, and is now 562 years old. Again, we are reminded of the Grail, the mere sight of which is enough to grant extended life. What better place than this spiritual no-man's land, between this world and the next, at a slight remove from reality but still historically attested to, for the earthly home of the Grail, sometimes called lapis exulis, which has been interpreted as the wish for paradise. And it is precisely here that Wolfram places it by inference, if not in actuality, by making Prester John the eventual guardian of the Grail. In doing so, he is once again following his habit of borrowing from Eastern sources and placing them in a Christianized framework. He shows us quite clearly that his sympathies lie with Islam, and at the same time gives his own version of Prester John's origin. Gameret, Perceval's father, puts himself at the service of Islam as a mercenary, because it satisfies his need for perfect spiritual knighthood in a way that service to a Western lord cannot. By Belcan, a Muslim woman, he has a child named Phairafis, who is Perceval's half-brother. It is interesting to note that Belcan is described as black as night, while Herzeloid, Perceval's mother, is called clear as the light of the sun. As Gameret marries both ladies, he is incidentally reconciling dark and light, and by extension east and west. Phairafis, though a Muslim, is made almost as noble a character as Perceval. It is astonishing that Wolfram should consider a pagan capable of coming close to attaining a goal which many Christians could not, yet he allows Phairafis to reach the castle of the Grail, though when the stone is carried into the hall he cannot see it, the reason being that he has not been baptized. Phairafis has eyes only for the Grail Maiden, the daughter of the wounded king, and when matters are explained to him he says, "Is that her god? If I accept that god, can I marry her?" On being told that he may, Fidefis accepts baptism, the form of which is strange indeed. A font is brought in and placed before the Grail, at which it becomes filled with water. Perhaps, as has been suggested, the aqua permanens, or water of life, which is at once a concept of alchemy and also of far earlier times, when the cauldron rather than the cup was the focus of reverence. And on the Grail, that highest point of reference outside God, a message appears, one of tolerance for other races and creeds, including, as is made clear from its place in the narrative, the Muslims. If any member of the Grail company should, by the grace of God, be given mastery over a foreign folk, he must not speak to them of his race or his name, and must see to it that they gain their rights. Fidefis and the Grail King's daughter are married, and their son is Prester John, who rules over his kingdom with a scepter of emerald. He is thereby directly related to the Grail family, and in time becomes the guardian of the holy vessel. The Grail is thus transported out of this world, into the realm of the spirit, where it remains. The theme of Perceval is really the reconciliation of Christian and Muslim in a state which is beyond their differences, a paradise where both can live in peace. The Grail within. The quest for the Grail is never truly over. As much for today as for the time when the romances were first written down, it is a symbol of great richness, though its meaning is as enigmatic now as then. Though we may speculate as to the truth of the mystery, we are less equipped than men and women of the Middle Ages. They were nearer, not only in time, to the stories and to the mystery of things, and it is to those stories that we must turn for even the most tentative elucidation. It could be said that there are three kinds of Grail, apart from its many differing manifestations. There is the Grail of the heart, the Grail of the mind, and the Grail of the spirit. The Grail of the heart we view with our emotions, apprehending it with the essential part of our being, in the symbols of the cup and the spear. The Grail of the mind appears to the subjective approach, which sees the object through a penumbra of strangeness and tries to make sense of it. But the Grail of the spirit is now, as it has always been, a beacon which draws us towards it, willing or not, until we recognize it, or until it brings a change in us, as it did to the Arthurian world. Properly approached, however, the Grail is part of us, sets us free like the imprisoned waters which revitalize the wasteland. Not for nothing is the wine of the Eucharist called the spiritual drink. In the Mass of the Grail it is more than this, for at that Mass the fullness of the mystery is revealed. The participants saw emerging from the holy cup a naked man whose hands and feet and body were bleeding, and who said to them, "My knights, my sergeants, my loyal sons, you who in this mortal life have become spiritual creatures and who have sought me out so diligently that I can no longer hide myself from your eyes." Quête del Saint Graal. You who in this mortal life have become spiritual creatures. This, surely, is the reason for the quest. This desire to penetrate the Grail of one's own being. If the answer lies in some private inner mystery, the reason for the quest becomes a need to identify the inner being with the desired goal. He who achieves the Grail is the one who succeeds in healing both psycho-spiritual wound and the death-struck kingdom of the Grail King. The cup is a vessel of compassion, signifying wholeness. On his first visit to the castle, Perceval fails to ask the required question: whom does the Grail serve? Because he does not believe it to be his responsibility. In other words, he denies its value and efficacy for himself, turning from the truth he can see in search of one he cannot. His failure lies not so much in omitting to ask the ritual question as in his refusal to ask a simple, human, "O King, what ails thee?" Only by asking such a question can he identify his desire for perfection, passing the boundaries which divide him from it. In reality, it is he who serves the Grail, and the Grail who serves him. He is the Grail. Failure to recognize this results in separation and gives a new definition to the words lapis exulis. We expel ourselves from Eden. The idea is age-old and records the state of humanity's division within its own soul. The breach can be healed only when the nature of the wound is identified with its source. The questions, whom does the Grail serve, what is it, how may these things be, have to be asked anew by each quester. As James Joyce wrote, any object intensely regarded may be a gate of access to the aeon of the gods, and we can see that such a regard can have two results. Either the object becomes a vehicle of worship, like the Torah, the host, or the black stone, or it loses its separate identity, and a kind of exchange takes place, as in St. Paul's "I live no longer, Christ lives in me," or in the alchemist's contemplation of the lapis, which causes him to become one with it. The Grail Knight must see his own face reflected in the cup, and understand that the way he must travel, which may well be the longest, is without mediation. It is a direct experience of God. This is why, when Galahad sets sail for the city of Sarras, taking the Grail with him, it is gone from the sight of man forever. Sarras, like the quester once he has set out, is no longer entirely in this world from the moment when Galahad steps ashore. It is a world between two worlds, and the cup itself is the bridge. In Sarras, life in the Grail begins. The alchemist Arnold of Villanova wrote, "Make a round circle and you will have the stone of the philosophers." The Grail, whether as a stone, the product of symbolic alchemy, as a divine personage, or as a cup, the container or the contained, remains at the center of the circle, the center which is also the circumference, and to which all quests lead. The knights, in their wanderings, attain the goal that would have remained inaccessible had they gone purposely to the Grail Castle. In surrendering themselves to chance, they are able to make their way to the heart of the mystery, where some at least recognize the truth. Their adventures are only just beginning, for only from there can the way beyond be found.